It's totally fun. I have a lot more stories.
That you do.
Yeah.
That you do.
Guilty as charged with the stories.
Hey, gang, welcome once again to I've Got Something to Say, the podcast where I have something to say. My name's Chris Whiting, your host for this podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. This week's edition is called Spelunker, I Barely Know Her. So, I just took my daughter to college about 6 weeks ago. She's 18 now, almost 19, out on her own. But many, many years ago, when she was maybe 4 or 5 years old, I took her out to Worlds of Fun, and we were having a grand old time. Anybody who's been to Worlds of Fun is probably familiar with the octopus ride. And if you're not, if you've been to any kind of county fair or anything like that, they probably have an octopus ride. But in this ride, you sit in a chair next to one or two other people. You're not strapped in per se. So I was sitting in the chair, with Molly next to me, and she was cuddled up next to me. I had my arm around her. We were sitting, waiting for other people to be loaded onto the ride, and then the ride would start. And as we were sitting there, a little bitty leaf just fluttered down and landed on her head. And she had her hair pulled into two tight ponytails, or maybe pigtails is what you call them, one on each side of her head. And I was trying to pick this little leaf out, and I just could not get it out. And as I'm sitting there, I said, "Oh, Molly, you and your thick hair," as I'm trying to pull this little leaf out. And let me just say that moment for me was kind of a pristine moment. Becoming a father was not an easy thing for me. My wife and I weren't able to conceive easily and actually ended up adopting our daughters from China, which was lights out, an amazing experience, and I'm so thankful for it now. But as I'm sitting there, with my daughter that I've had maybe 3 years, I am so totally in love with her, and just having that moment where she's cuddled up against me, a little afraid of what the ride might bring, and me getting to comfort her and have my arm around her was just a special time. So I'm there and I'm looking at her sweet little head, and I'm trying to pull this leaf out of her hair and saying, "Oh, Molly, you and your thick hair." Well, she looked up at me and said, "Oh, Daddy." And hearing the word daddy just made my heart melt. I waited so long to have someone call me daddy. So she looks up at me and goes, "Oh, Daddy, you and your nose hair." And I realized at that moment that what each of us were seeing was entirely dependent upon our perspective or where we were looking from. I'm seeing this beautiful child that I've loved since before she was born, and so just excited to be next to her. And then she looks up and sees my nostrils, which are overgrown and jungle-esque. And that's been a consistent theme throughout my life, just this reminder that our perspective determines what we see and also determines the direction that we head and where we go. There was an earlier time in my life where this became very apparent to me as well. And this was back when I was in the Boy Scouts. And I know we've talked about Boy Scouts before. It was very important in my formative years. Overall, I enjoyed Boy Scouts, but there was one part of the Boy Scouts that I did not care for, and that was the overnights. So once a month, the troop would have an overnight. We would go camping somewhere. And as a kid, I would go camping with my family. We all had travel trailers, and I loved it. Oh my gosh. I still cherish those memories to this day of going out with the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents, caravanning out to Colorado or California or South Dakota, wherever, and camping. But when I got into Boy Scouts, I realized I don't really like camping. I loved going with the family, being in the trailer, and I loved it because my parents did all the work. But when I went to Boy Scouts, you got to set up your own tent. You're sleeping in a tent on the ground. You're not in a trailer. When it rains, everything gets wet and musty and nasty. When you come home, your clothes smell like a campfire. I hated it. I hate camping. And it's taken me a long time to be able to say this. I hate camping. I don't want to do it. If I go on vacation, I want to be in a hotel room. I want to have room service available. I might not take advantage of it, but I want to know it's available. I want to have my channels available on my TV, and I want to have Wi-Fi so I can see the Netflix if I want to do that. There. I've gotten it out. I don't like camping. So to get your Eagle Scout, you had to go on a certain number of overnights, and I did the bare minimum. Most of the kids went every month. I only went when I had to meet a requirement for a merit badge or a skill award. Except one time we were going to do an overnight, and instead of doing the typical thing where we would just go out and camp in a campground and cook some crappy food, and stay Friday night, Saturday night, come home Sunday morning, that was the worst. Driving back, listening to American Top 40, and then just thinking, I'm going to get home at 2 this afternoon, and then I've got like 4 hours, and I got to start thinking about going to school the next day. It was the worst. I hated it. But this one particular overnight, we were going to go spelunking or cave exploring on a farm. This farmer had a cave, and not only were we going to travel through the cave, but we were going to sleep in the cave. So this seemed pretty badass to me. So we got down to the farm. We went into the cave and put down our sleeping bags, and there were a bunch of different rooms. And so I was with like 3 or 4 other boys, and we look up, and there's a whole bunch of bats hanging from the ceiling. And for some reason, I thought that was so cool that I was going to sleep underneath bats. And the farmer had told us, you're going to hear them fly out, like late at night. They go out and eat bugs, whatever I don't know what bats do. They go do what bats do. But I thought it was so kick-ass to be sleeping underneath bats, not realizing that bats probably poop when they're hanging up there, and it's going to go somewhere. But I thought it was so cool. So we get there, we set everything up, we sleep, and then on Saturday we go explore the cave. And so they had told us, stick together as a group. We're going to follow the path through the cave. We had hard hats, which I thought was cool. We had our flashlights. This was going to be awesome. So we start taking off. Well, I was with, some of the cooler guys in the troop, which I know when you're talking a scout troop, the bar is kind of set low for that. But we were sort of hanging back from the main group, being cool guys. That's what you do. So we're going through this cave. All of a sudden we realize there's nobody ahead of us that we can see. We've lost sight of their lights. We can't hear them anymore. There's nobody coming up behind us, and we're stuck. And so there's probably 5 of us in this room that I'm going to guess is maybe like 10 by 12-ish. And we're in mud. It's wet. It's muddy. We've actually seen some salamanders, and we cannot find our way out of this place. So we're, shining flashlights around. And at first it's like, well, I mean, somebody's going to be coming up behind us, or somebody's going to be coming back. So we're just making jokes and, ha ha, what if they never find us this? And ha ha, Donner Party that. And, trying to be funny and trying to be cool. And it's going pretty rapid fire. Like we're just building off of each other. But the jokes and the velocity of the jokes start to slow down a little bit as time passes. And there's longer periods of silence as we're sitting there. And I don't know what I am there, maybe 13-year-old Chris starts having these thoughts creep into his mind of, what if nobody finds you? What if you're stuck here and you die in muddy scout pants at 13 years old, having never known a woman, and never experienced all that life has to offer. And I'm trying to push these thoughts out of my mind, but the fact that we are in a cave and can't find our way around just makes it seem like not only are the walls closing in inside the cave, but like the walls of the mind are closing in, and it feels like my thoughts are becoming claustrophobic. And eventually one kid started to cry. I'm shocked that it wasn't me. But he started to cry, and instead of making fun, like we're consoling, like helping the kid out, hey, it's going to be okay. We're going to get out of here. It's fine. I was flat out freaked out of my mind. And then we're like we should conserve the batteries on the flashlights. So we're sitting in the dark and then taking turns, turning on our flashlight, and we don't know where to go. We cannot find our way out. Well, finally, one kid, and I don't remember who it was. It could have been me or it could have been one of the 4 or 5 other kids, turns his flashlight on, and he's just kind of just turning it on, turning it off, turning it on, turning it off, but it's pointed up the ceiling, and somebody looks up as his flashlight goes off, says, hey, turn your flashlight back on, put it up there. He turns it on. Up on the ceiling of this room we're in is an arrow spray painted pointing toward one of the walls. So we follow that and see another arrow spray painted, and we find a little tiny hole that we were able to crawl through the mud to get out. And then we found more arrows and actually a string to hang on to, and we found our way back to the group, which I've never been so relieved in my life. But it was so interesting to me, and yet another reminder that our perspective and where we focus and what we look at determines where we go. We could have sat there and panicked and freaked out, which we were for a while, but changing the way we looked and the direction we were looking gave us a different perspective on what we could do to get out of the cave. So, little life lesson for there. It's one of those that just continues to pop up in my mind. I don't want this podcast to be about life lessons and let's be a better person, but for me, that was one that I remember that was repeated years later when I was sitting with my daughter, and continues to pop up to me, that simply changing your perspective and how you feel about things, how you look at things can change the direction you're going and the velocity with which you get there. So that's it for this edition of I've Got Something to Say. I'm Chris Whiting. Thank you so much for listening. Please tune in next week where we will have another exciting story to listen to. Big thanks to KCTK Radio and my good friend Paul for making this happen. They produce, they put it together, they put it out there. These stories would not be getting to you if not for KCTK. So check out some of their other fine programming. I'll talk to you next week.